I would like to start out by thanking everyone for taking my initial video seriously, and say that I am gratified that something of a debate has taken off. First thing first, I'll address Heavy Traffic Ahead's comments regarding facing gum-popping 14-year-olds in the jury when tried for a capital offence. I will admit that jury duty is something I never thought to mention in my video, but will say this. If minors on juries were on the cards, there would still be a selection process, and I doubt that a belligerent adolescent with his or her feet up on the desk, refusing to look at anyone, chewing gum the whole time and sneering at authority would be chosen. Would also point out that I, at the age of 32, still have never been called, and so how often would this happen anyway? I also think my point about, for example, awesome rants versus bionic dance would still stand. There are plenty of adults I would not want to decide on my guilt, innocence, or my fate. Beyond the selection process, juries are not unsupervised, so in this hypothetical situation where there is a 14-year-old in a jury, let's be realistic, it's only going to be one or two and only sometimes, not a majority, well, a group of adults are very unlikely to elect a 14-year-old foreman, just as they're unlikely to listen to someone very obviously immature. But some teenagers can impress a great deal, and maybe deserve to be taken more seriously. The main point, however, would be that I made a distinction between those things which protect either the individual or society, and argued that voting age specifically does not, which I'll return to later. Also, please bear in mind that voting, at least in the UK, the US, Canada, and doubtless many other countries, is optional, but almost any adult can vote if they choose to. Jury duty, however, is mandatory, but selected groups cannot, even if they do want to. Anybody below the age of 16 must already be in full-time education by law anyway, and those aged 16 to 18 are likely to be in some form of further education or training for a job, or possibly doing resits, or are in part-time education. Since you have no idea how long a trial will take, or for how long the jury will need to deliberate, obviously it would be bad for the teens in question to be removed from the education system. It could be weeks, even months. This would therefore come under protecting them, and those in full-time education are already a group exempt from jury duty. If the reference to jury duty was simply meant as a comparison to make a point, I shall reiterate that 1. You are called for jury duty, and have to try to get out of it. Voting is only mandatory in certain countries. 2. As I said in the original video, you have to register to vote, which, assuming we safeguard against parents doing this on their children's behalf, bearing in mind the ballot itself would still be secret, shows a presence of mind and an interest in politics. A couple of people have voiced the view that we should let kids be kids while they can and not put this on their shoulders. One of KC's points was that young people could feel guilt or shame over the decision they made, and this is unfair to them. But again, I am not talking about a mandatory vote. Some people mature faster than others, and some school kids take more of an interest in politics than others. In the opening of Ceh Beskow's first video on the subject, he talks about being a child who would stubbornly insist he wanted to vote for Donald Duck, and could not, when questioned, name a single political party. I would simply say that he must have been in an age group that would not, in reality, choose to take the time and put in the effort to register, and then remember and still care when the time came to go to the polling station. I know a family near me with children aged 8 to 15. To go with the 8-year-old, I will say that having spoken to her about Doctor Who, I was surprised that she understood the concept of metaphor. Seeing Doctor Who, a show designed to appeal on different levels, beyond the surface, grasping metaphor. This, as I understand it, is a sign of having entered the age of reason, which I believe is expected around the age of 9 or 10 and not unheard of in an 8-year-old. I will also note that when seeing that the same-sex couple in Doctor Who had married, and this went out at 5:15 on Christmas Day, she did not say, "But women are meant to marry men," but rather accepted it, something children in the UK will soon have to. And this is despite being from a Christian family, albeit one with a number of LGBT friends, myself included. This in itself, I believe, shows a political awareness. Others may disagree. I would also think that those 4 21st century British children, the oldest of whom is 15, are raised with enough news television at home, accessibility to the internet, and I would guess discussion at school to be able to say at least who the Prime Minister is, even if perhaps the 8-year-old wouldn't necessarily be able to name a party. I'd have to ask her. I can say that by the age of 8 I definitely knew the Tories were in charge, Thatcher was Prime Minister, and the opposition were called the Labour Party, easily distinguishable by the blue and red colours respectively. I will, however, admit the first election I recall was 1992 when I was 11, but that's not to say I wouldn't have noticed one if I had been 10 or 9. Would I, unaided and with no reminder, have registered to vote and then done so? I doubt it. But this merely filters out those not yet sufficiently developed. Although one factor which may discourage voting at such an age is that voting isn't cool, only boffins vote. This could show the early teens as unsuitable for voting, but only if we accept unfairness to those 11, 12 and 13-year-olds who do take an interest, who, let's face it, are likely to receive some bullying anyway, and it would be their choice whether to vote or how open to be about it. XK then talked about embracing the Donald Duck vote, where I will simply side with you, James, and say that it does simply come down to trust, and also reiterate my earlier point about mature teens I would trust to vote versus the adults that make me nervous. I also still believe such a system would be, for the most part at least, self-regulating for the reasons I gave in my original video. However, XC does then proceed to make a point I confess I had not considered. Party political broadcasts targeting children's television. Could it be all the cool kids are voting communist? Is it cool to vote UKIP like it's cool to own Nike trainers? Are you no one if you didn't vote BNP, like you're no one if you don't have the latest Xbox? On the one hand, there'll always be a voice of dissent. Don't forget the emo kids who refuse to run with the crowd. But on the other hand, in the past few years we've seen a BNP puppet that resembles a Muppet, and the British National Party have been known to produce music to appeal to the young and indoctrinate them, and this is certainly a concern, not wishing to step on anybody's freedom of speech. So indeed, political groups are not always above using certain methods to brainwash specifically the young, so I will concede that for this to work, political advertising for minors would need to be extremely well regulated. I think we can all safely agree that a party political broadcast on CBeebies would be rather inappropriate, although I can also imagine a child that small just getting bored unless the advert in question were very expertly made, which of course it might be. So thank you, this was certainly a factor I had not considered. Would campaigning and even policy generally be brought down to appeal to the young vote? I think Ujames already made the point that we would be talking about an insignificant proportion of the electorate, and as I said before, the older vote is already disproportionate, causing parties to chase them. These voters may have experience on their side, but could also be out of touch, vote out of habit, and be too fixed in their ways. If anything, getting parties to chase the youth vote would act as a counterbalance. In the US, Fox News themselves made the observation that their views decline as their viewers die off. In other words, a type of right-wing conservatism will end, or change, as the old American right die. Change comes with new generations. As an aside, a couple of people, including Old Vampire, have suggested minors taking a test to prove they can vote sensibly. Personally, I see no reason to have those for children and teenagers and not adults, and would simply rather school children were encouraged to discuss, debate, research and think, at the end of which taking a test to prove you can be trusted to vote is simply not in line with what we usually believe about elections and politics. The most unqualified adults can vote. Ceh Beskow also made a very interesting video about discrimination and prejudice, including the questions of whether we discriminate against minors and if discrimination is ever necessary. I don't know if I'll be replying to that video as well, but it's more of a response to you, James, than to me. I do, however, recommend people go and watch all these videos, and please do subscribe to Ceh's channel, which I think is criminally undersubbed. Regards, Al.